What's up everyone, it's the Law School Lumberjack here again with another video. Today we're going to be doing another installment of our LSAT tips series, and today we're going to be talking about flaw questions. Now, flaw questions are an area in the LSAT Logical Reasoning Section that are extremely important. They often show up and are an area where a lot of students have quite a bit of trouble. So what we're going to do in this video is give a brief introduction on flaw type questions, then we'll go through the common types of flaws, and finally, I'll give you some tips on how to answer flaw questions correctly. Now, as an introduction, the heart of a flaw question essentially is one where the evidence doesn't lead to the conclusion properly for some way or another. Now, how this manifests itself is oftentimes varied. It could be for reasons that the evidence or the support or the premises don't logically lead to the conclusion, so there's essentially very technical jumps in logic, or it could be because the evidence or the means of gathering the evidence was incorrect. Now, in the tips section, I'm going to go through this a bit more, but essentially just remember the crux of a flaw is that the evidence somehow doesn't lead to the conclusion properly. Now, correctly answering flaws oftentimes is based on understanding some of the basic common types of flaw questions. So I'm going to go through 5 common types of flaw questions in this video. The first one is the relative versus absolute distinction, also known as real numbers versus percentages. This is a pretty common flaw. It may not be the most common, but it is good in that once you get used to answering these types of questions, they're easy to spot and pretty hard to get wrong. The most important thing to remember here is that percentages are relative, so obviously 95% of a very small group doesn't actually lead to a large real number. So let's say you have a question on an LSAT exam that basically has some sort of obstacle course for animals. And the argument states that 50% of dogs who have run through this course finish the course. However, only 5% of cats who run this course are able to finish it. Based on those premises, without further information, the conclusion would be flawed if it said that more dogs finished the race than cats. The reason for this is the interplay between percentages and the actual sample size. So let's say there were 104 animals that ran this course, 4 of them were dogs and 100 were cats. Well, 50% of 4 is 2, and 5% of 100 is 5. So in fact, based on the percentages, we can't say the actual absolute number or real number of animals that actually finish the course because we don't know the sample size. And that's really the crux of the percentage versus real number flaw that you see in a lot of LSAT questions. The second type of flaw you'll often see is one that deals with correlation versus causation. So this flaw essentially occurs when 2 variables exist and they interplay off of each other. However, the argument incorrectly assumes that there's a causal relationship between the two. So by way of example, let's say you have a question on your LSAT exam that says, based on a statistically relevant sampling, the average lifespan in Seattle is 95 years old, and the average lifespan in Hawaii is 100 years old. It would be a flawed conclusion without further evidence to say that if you want to live longer, move to Hawaii. Based on the premises, there is admittedly a correlation between where one lives and the life expectancy, but it's incorrect to assume that just simply moving to Hawaii is going to somehow increase your life expectancy. Basically, the crux of that is all we can say from the data given is that there's a correlation, not that there's causation. The third common flaw that you tend to see, and this is very difficult to catch, is the necessary versus sufficient distinction. Now, I previously did a video on necessary and sufficient assumptions. If you haven't gone through that or looked at it yet, it would be probably very helpful to look through it because I explain necessary and sufficient assumptions in great detail and give explanations for what those mean. But very briefly, a necessary condition is basically a condition that is required for an outcome to happen, but in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily cause the outcome to happen. The sufficient condition is one where if that condition exists, the outcome has to happen. So let's give an example. Let's talk about a Mentos and Coke, basically bottle rocket. So for those who aren't aware, if you stick Mentos in Coke and close the lid, basically your bottle explodes one way or another. The Mentos and the Coke are both necessary for the reaction to occur in that without one of them, the reaction can't occur. However, each one on their own is not sufficient to cause a reaction because it's the combination of the two that make the explosion. So essentially, with a Mentos and Coke bottle rocket, the Mentos and Coke are necessary. The combination of the Mentos and Coke, or putting them together in the bottle, is the sufficient condition. So what you're going to want to do in these types of questions where you identify that there is necessary and sufficient conditions is make sure that the conclusion doesn't mistake a necessary condition for a sufficient condition or vice versa. Number 4 is where there's insufficient evidence to justify the conclusion. This isn't as common as the previous 3, but it's basically one where there's a leap in logic, and that usually arises from some sort of shift in language. For example, if in your LSAT exam you see an argument that says, in a statistically relevant sample, 90% of people have stated that they enjoy candy, it would be logically flawed to say that because of that statement, a vast majority of people enjoy chocolate. All we know from that statement is a vast majority of people enjoy candy in general. It may be that 90% of those people like candy because they like gummy worms and not chocolate. So we have to be careful of the wording, and you need to make sure that the conclusion is justified by the premise and that there's sufficient evidence to get you to the conclusion. The final relatively common flaw you'll see, although it's probably not as common as the first 3, is how the party obtained the data that they're giving you. I'll go through this a bit more in the tips section, but you want to be very careful in how you approach these questions. You specifically want to look at the process of how that data was obtained, not the data itself. So if the argument specifically states something that makes you question how that data was obtained or the statistical relevance of that data, it may be that that is the flaw in the argument, especially if there's no logical jumps. So one example is with sample sizes. Let's say you have a situation where a party surveys 10 people and says, well, based on that, 9 out of the 10 people I sampled state X, and therefore 90% of people would state X as well. Because 10 people is not a statistically relevant sampling size, that would be a potential flaw. So if you're going to rely on this flaw type, you're going to want to make sure that there's something glaring in the argument that points you to that. You don't want to make up potential issues with the evidence. You want to rely on something in the premises that makes it clear that the evidence was incorrectly obtained one way or another. So to end off this video, I'm going to talk about 3 tips to help you when you're answering flaw questions. The first is to identify the conclusion right away. While this is important arguably in any question type, it's extremely important in flaw type questions. The reason for that is if there's a logical flaw in your argument, you need to know the conclusion to determine what that logical flaw is or where that logical flaw is in the argument. Tip number 2 is you have to accept the raw data as given, although if the raw data clearly was obtained through incorrect means, that's a potential flaw. I briefly alluded to this in the 5th common flaw type, but I'll go through it in a bit more detail here. What I mean by that is, if the LSAT tells you that 90% of people in a study believe that broccoli is tasty, you have to accept that as a given. You can't challenge the fact that 90% of people in that study thought broccoli was delicious. So for example, if the answer said it's impossible that many people like broccoli, that would clearly be an incorrect answer. Now, while you can't argue the raw data, if it's clear from the premises that there's something wrong with how that data was obtained, you can attack the mechanism for obtaining that data. But as a sub-tip, I'd be very careful with this. Make sure that when you're attacking the mechanisms for obtaining the data, that you're not going too far and that you're basing your argument or the flaw in something that's very clear in the premise. So if, as in my common flaw types example, it says that I only surveyed 10 people, you can attack that. But if it doesn't state that the sample size was unreasonable, don't make up that the sample size is unreasonable. So to conclude on tip number 2, you can attack the mechanism for obtaining the evidence if it's clear that there is something wrong with that process. However, don't attack the raw data or the evidence itself. And tip number 3 is to remember that as a general rule, the answer to a flaw question will lie in either the reliability of the evidence or how the conclusion is drawn based on the evidence as given. Remembering this in the back of your mind will help you narrow the search for what you're looking for. For example, if you look at the data and the way the data was obtained, and there's nothing glaring that's wrong with the data, then you're going to want to look at, is there something logically wrong with how the conclusion is drawn from the evidence as given? If you're going through everything and have satisfied yourself that the conclusion must logically follow from the evidence, then you might want to ask, is there maybe a throwaway line in the argument itself that suggests that the data was obtained through improper means, whether it be through an incorrect sample size, incorrectly dealing with control groups, etc. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Take care. See you next time.